Today, from the city of Alva, Oklahoma, we are interviewing Mr. and Mrs. Floyd Wilcox. The Wilcoxes live north of Alva, known as the Grimes Farm. Your interviewer today is James Cadigan for the Oklahoma Living Legends and the Oklahoma Historical Society. First, Ms. Wilcox, tell us something about your background, where you're born. We understand you're a real Oklahoman. Was born at Enid, Oklahoma. Let's hear it about Enid and some of your people back in your early days.
When I was a child, my father used to go hunting. And, I didn't know where, I thought it must have been a jumping off place. He would leave on a train early in the morning from Enid with some friends and all of his hunting paraphernalia. And then they would go west to what is now Hopeton and Avard. The end of the line was Avard. He would arrive there in the morning, hunt all day. The train turned around there and then went back to Enid in the evening. I never realized at that time that someday I would be living in Alva, which is just north of the place where my father used to hunt. We moved from Enid to Great Bend, Kansas when I was in the upper grade school, and then from there, with my parents, we moved to Alva. I met my husband at the Northwestern Normal School then, and when we were married, we moved first south of town and lived there for 4 years, and then we bought the farm where we now live. We bought this farm in the spring of 32, and then moved there in the spring of 34. Where we live is the farm known as the A.C. Grimes Farm. We are the 5th owners of this particular farm. When we had just moved in 1934, we hadn't unpacked yet. Everything was around in boxes and nothing, beds not set up and so forth. On Sunday afternoon, I happened to look out the front window and a car drove in. All the people, of course, Sunday afternoon were all dressed in their Sunday clothes. And I learned later that the man driving the car, an elderly man at that time, in 1934, he was 82 years old. He said that when he had been a young man, I suppose it would be the cavalry, that he had camped many times near a spring. It was in our pasture. He made the women and the little boy who was with them walk down that way, and I felt sorry for the women because they had on open shoes to walk clear down through the pasture to see this spring where he had camped at one time. He said that they made it a point as they went through the country. I suppose it would be maybe as they came from, maybe towards Wichita or maybe Fort Riley or up in there someplace, going toward Camp Supply, bringing supplies or moving troops. And he said they always tried to make it there so they could set up camp at night because of the good water in this spring, that they would fill their barrels there for their drinking water. I don't know just when this may have been, probably in the 1870s. We have large trees in our yard and up and down our lane. Some of these large cottonwood trees are, I expect probably 20 feet in circumference down at the base. And he said that those trees were that large at that time as they are today, 1972. He said that many soldiers passed through there in those days, going and coming. I don't know that there's too much told about the Indians in this part of the country, and I had never realized that there were that many cavalrymen and that many Indians in this country back before the opening of the Cherokee outlet. The connection that our farm has with Alva, I think maybe would be mostly in connection with the drinking water. When right after the run, the first drinking water that was sold in Alva may have come from this same spring in our pasture, and it was sold by the cup. Then later on, after they had established the places where they were going to live, either set up some sort of a shack or a tent or whatever they intended to live in for a short time, water then was hauled into the town site and was sold for 25 cents a barrel. Now in 1903, there had been erected a water tower in the south part of Alva. This is after the college had been built. And this picture shows the water tower, and then the back, the south side of the college, and the big smokestack that used to be there. And according to old newspapers and records, this tank holds 65,000 gallons of water. It's about 112 feet high. Now, since Mr. Grimes and the Alva, the city of Alva, didn't have this contract for the water rights on the Grimes farm until 1912, some of us have wondered just where that water did come from at that time. Also, records show that in the early days they held what they call baptizings. And the favorite place around Alva was at what they called Grimes Pond, which was just west of where our home is now, on the bank where our home now sits, located. People would sit and watch these baptizings. And one in particular that, there is a record of it, of a Methodist minister who preached the first Methodist sermon in Alva in October of 1893. That would be about a month after the opening. The picture shows the Reverend M.T. Long and a man and his wife, a Mr. and Mrs. William Friend, who were immersed in this Grimes Pond. And according to the caption under the picture, there were 900 people present at the time of this baptizing, as they called them. Mr. Grimes seems to have been very prominent in the early day history of Alva. He was very much interested in horses, race horses, and beautiful matched teams. Originally, he came down from, he was a native of Tennessee, and on the run, now he came down from north of Pond Creek. He and the friend drove the first horse and buggy into Pond Creek. But then within a month, he came west then to Alva and selected where we now live, known as the Grimes Farm. Within 10 years, this farm was considered one of the best watered and the finest fruit farms in Woods County. He had this one team that he was particularly fond of, and I have heard some of the old-timers speak of Mr. Grimes' horses. he had been offered quite large sums of money for this team, but he had said many times he wouldn't take less than $1,000 for them. When Mr. Grimes made the water contract with Alva in 1912, he must have moved into Alva then shortly after that, because people have said that he had I think it must have been a blacksmith shop on what's now West Flynn, probably about where the paper office is now. And Mr. Grimes then died about 2 years after this water contract was made, sometime in 1914, or maybe 15. He left a widow, and they had an adopted daughter. And then the next owner of the farm then was W.R. Maxwell, who was the old-time, well, they called him the owner of the greenhouse then. He was the old-time florist, we call him now, who owned the Grimes farm then for several years. And then he sold it. We are the fifth owners of this farm.
Ms. Wilcox, tell us something about Mr. Wilcox. What connection his father had with the Cherokee Run, or the run of September 16, 1893?
My husband's stepfather made the run from Attica, Kansas. He came down with a load of lumber and set himself up in the lumber business on the north side of the square. Oh, I think they say approximately where the Rialto Theater building is now. He sold the first lumber that was sold in the Alva town site. Later then, he had a large lumber yard down on North College, close to the Santa Fe Railroad tracks. And of course they had coal that they sold in those days also. And then he filed on I think it was a school land, wasn't it? What they called the school land, that south of town. And he also later owned the ranch northwest of Alva. He built what's known as the Crowell House, which was one of, well, I guess it was the largest house in Alva at that time.
Ms. Wilcox, tell us something about how life was on the farm before electricity come to the farm.
When my husband and I were first married in May of 1930, we lived in a house south of Alva, the farm that Mr. Crowell had I guess he homesteaded it. And of course we had no running water, no electricity. We had the gasoline lights, the kind, of course, that had the mantles and the pump that you'd have to pump the air into to get your light. We had, of course, the hand crank separator at that time, and milk, I think 12, 17 cows. And the water, we had good soft water. It came from a cistern on the back porch, which we always said we cranked. The stock drank from water in a large tank from a windmill out in the yard.
When you first attended school, can you remember some of the incidents back in early part of your first schooling. Tell us something about them, and also uh, we understand you were later on a school teacher.
Well, I had my first schooling in Enid, and what at that time was the old Kenwood School. It's in that would be in the west part of Enid. I remember how we used to always have to line up outside to march in, and somebody or other who would know how to play one of these triangles would keep time, and we were to march by that. And I had always thought, well, how great it would be to know enough to stand there, then everybody marching into this beat that I'd be beating on this triangle. Then then we moved to Kansas, and I attended school up there then during high school. After I came to Alva and continued my college education, then I taught school in Alva High School for 3 years. That would be the 28, 29, and 30. The Alva High School was where the junior high is right now. On this location was at one time a park. It was called the West Park. Where the old armory is called the East Park, or maybe the Northeast Park. But this was the West Park, and was a grove of locust trees before they built the high school building there. My husband's stepfather bought the brick that was left over from the building of the old high school and the garage on the property across the street south of the building. It was built out of the brick that was left over from the old high school building.
Ms. Wilcox, you attended college here in Alva. Now, during the time you attended college, was the name the same, and is the college very much the same now, or what improvements or what has taken place since you went to college there?
You know, the enrollment is so much larger, of course. The campus is larger, and then the buildings. When I came to Alva, most of my classes were held in what was called the old castle on the hill, which later burned. They had the building, which was the training school in those days, and then they had the old gymnasium, which was called the Wyatt Gymnasium. Those were just about the only buildings. Of course, they had well, I was attending school there. They built the Herod Hall, and that was such an improvement. We all thought that was such a wonderful modern building at that time. At that time, they didn't have semesters. They had what they called terms. Instead of 2 semesters, they had 4 terms. That was in order for those who were out teaching school to be able to come back in the spring and receive one term of education. Because the country schools then, maybe 7 months or so would be there. Didn't have enough money to keep those country schools open any longer than that. So we had these 4 terms. And we'd have, of course, a larger enrollment every spring term because all these teachers would come back and could continue their education in that way.
During all this schooling and all these times that you're teaching and all that you got involved in, did you have very much time left for your church work or your civic affairs?
Well, I think maybe those are the things that we maybe did all the time. We didn't have so many other things that we tried to keep up with that we do now. Of course, I had so much grading to do in those days, and then we had more things connected with the school and with the church. I know they had a girls' basketball team that went out to all these small towns at that time. Just before I came to Alva, they had this girls' championship basketball team that went back to New York State and came out first in the nation. So, of course, girls' basketball was very important then when I was teaching, which was just a short time after that. And then, of course, somebody had to be the chaperone for the girls, as they made all these little towns all around, and that was my job. We'd ride on the bus around to these various towns, and I'd be with the girls, and they'd play their game, and then go to the locker with them, and they'd change, and we'd ride the bus back home of an evening, or night, actually. But, of course, they don't have the girls' basketball at Alva right now, that is, in a competitive way. As far as I know right now, there were a good many years they didn't have any girls' basketball at all. But it seems to me that they had more things that were time-consuming connected either with the schools or with the churches. I know now we don't have so many of the school teachers teaching Sunday school classes. Well, I know at that time that was expected of a school teacher, so teach a Sunday school class, and I know I did. I had a Sunday school class in the Presbyterian Church, and I think so many of the teachers did do a great deal of church work in those days. Some of them, of course, still do. I'm not saying now that they don't, but so many of the activities of all ages seem to be centered around the school and the church more than now.
Mr. Wilcox, tell us something about those famous cattle runs you used to have here in the vicinity of Alva. You know where they moved forcing the cattle from one side of town to the next?
Well, in the early days, my stepfather had a ranch in northwestern Oklahoma. Well, he'd been in the cattle business since the strip was opened in the old M County. And he kept on after it was changed to Wood County. He had several thousand acres of pasture land, and he would go into New Mexico and Arizona and buy this cattle, this whitefish cattle, and bring them up, would ship them by train up here. And then they was wild, and I forget what they did bring, something around $10 a head, maybe 12. And we'd take them out to the ranch and run them on grass. If we got them in the fall, we'd take them to the wheat pasture and then turn them and ship them to Kansas City. But we had some wheat ground out at the ranch, and we tried to winter them. This ranch was 23 miles northwest of Alva. Well, we didn't have trucks in those days, all cattle. And so we'd have to round these cattle up and bring them by horseback, drive them. And then the only big problem was is when we hit this town of Alva, the stockyards was on the northeast part of town. And we had to come in from the northwest and come down the full length of Alva to go down towards the river to the railroad. And it seemed like to me, every time we hit town, all the women would have their washing on the line. They'd have their gardens out and their flower beds. And you can imagine what these cattle would do that's never been around human beings on foot. Well, of all the time we'd get them through there, and then their dogs would help them too. They'd interfere, they'd get the cattle riled up. And seemed like there must have been 10,000 dogs along at that time. And they'd run on these people's lawns And these women would come out, and you don't know how vicious a woman is when her flower bed or her garden or her yard is run over by a whole 50, 75 head of cattle. And you can imagine what she said to us, and which we couldn't do a thing about, and we couldn't help it. We had to get the cattle to the stockyard. And then when we get closer to town, why, we had to ride her ahead on horseback, and to kind of warn the people to get back. And there's one old gentleman walking along there, and they warned him, and he wasn't paying attention. He was kind of a stubborn type. And he kept right on walking. Well, we had one cow there. We'd been pushing pretty hard, and she was wild. She was mean. And she spotted him a foot. And she took in for him. And we yelled at him, and thank goodness that he did turn around and see her coming. And he took out. And that cow right back up. And he made it into a livery stable. Dashed in there and jumped in the manger and then crawled on up to the top. And there that old cow had that old boy in there, and we had to take a horse in there to get her away from him. And I bet to this day, when anybody yelled at him again about cattle, I said he started running.
Mr. Wilcox, this must have been, you observing those cattle going from one part of town to another, and you being such a cowboy that you were, to herd them and get them over where they sent to the market to Kansas City. I bet that's where you got some of your ideas about your football playing. We understand you were quite a football boy during your day. Tell us about it.
I played football at Alva High School under John McCormick and for 4 years. And this team that finally got together, there's two schools at Alva, grade schools. One was they called the East School, and one the West School. Well, we played with each other or against each other all up till we got to the age of high school. And then when we got to high school, we all made the team. And McCormick was the coach, and he was in fact, a lot of us had practiced against him when he was playing at Northwestern College. And so we finally got him voted in to be coach down there, and we kind of cleaned up over the teams that we ever played. We really had a team that was not doing any bragging about it. That was, what was I going to say?
How about your practice sessions?
Oh, well, he was pretty rough. He learned us how to tackle and to make that shoestring tackle. Well, he had a dummy on the scaffold there. You're supposed to get back so far, and a certain line he had drawn across the line, this line. When you hit that line, you're supposed to leave your feet, and you're supposed to tackle that dummy around the ankles. And he was standing right there at that line. And if you did not get down low enough, he had a big long paddle. And man, that boy sure could use it. That's the way we learned to play football. And then when we got, I guess we really did do pretty good all over the country here. There's quite a record down there to the high school. And we start from the high school when we're going to play a team here at Alva. We start down at the high school, which is a junior college now. We'd run to the square and go straight south up to the college, was called the normal school, a college. And in back of there, they had the football ground. Well, when we'd come through the square running, why, the merchants would close their stores and come on up and watch the football game at that time.
Mr. Wilcox, during your time on the farm and dealing with cattle, you're talking about some stories in connection with the cattle business, and you're handling them cattle. Tell us about some of them.
Well, one experience we had, it was when I got married, I married a city girl. And we, of a spring or a fall, we brought these cattle from New Mexico and Arizona here, and we branded and dehorned and vaccinated for blackleg. And we'd have several hundred head at the time. Basically, we had as many as 500 head of cattle to work in a day. And this is fast as we could run it through little chutes to dehorn and vaccinate and castrate and brand. Why, some of them in the holding pen, but we couldn't drive them in right real quick, so we just moved more in. And one of them especially, well, we got down to the last, and we've been fighting him all day long. And he was hot. It was a hot day in that spring, and he was awful hot. And then when we got him into the chute and pulled the holding, the head part, hold the head, I forget the name of it just right now, and it was two-by-four, between two other two-by-fours in the narrow fence line, called a chute. And when we brought that two-by-four down with this rope, but he gets them right back to the head, and they hold them. Then you flip your bar to it. When we brought that, pulled that two-by-four, the locky, it must have come with more force than we thought. It killed him. Well, we didn't want to waste the beef, and there was summertime when we didn't have that. There wasn't any butchers at that time. You butchered your own meat. And so my stepfather said, well, told one of the boys, why, you boys load the beef up and take it down in this truck. We had an old Model T truck, I believe it was. No, it was a Model T truck. And you can imagine over those rough roads, there wasn't any roads hardly. And we take that beef down south. And so he had an old car, I believe that was an old Willis Knight. So he drove that on ahead and went on down to the farm. That was south of Alton. And to notify my wife that the beef was, the men would be there with the beef. And she was a city girl, and she thought maybe, don't know what she was thinking, she thought maybe we butchered the beef like you just called a hog. Old Willis Knight. So he drove that on ahead and went on down to the farm. That was south of Alton. And to notify my wife that the beef was, the men would be there with the beef. And she was a city girl, and she thought maybe, don't know what she was thinking, she thought maybe we butchered the beef like you just called a hog. She asked her, you want me to get the water hot? And I'm not sure about this.
Mr. Wilcox, you must have some stories too about the farm that would some funny ones maybe.
Well, most of the stories are really on me because I was so ignorant of all the things, the way of farm life in that time. But when we were first married, my sister was helping me. We had so many harvest hands to cook for, and she was helping me. We did our own churning, and after we had turned the butter looks such a pale yellow. Well, this is right after we first started having the oleomargarine, and it didn't come colored in those days. It came with a little sort of a jelly-like capsule that you would prick and mix it yourself in the oleo to make it look like butter, because it was against the law to sell it if it was yellow. Well, there was a box of what we thought some of these oleo capsules to color the oleo yellow. So we decided we'd put some of that in there to make the butter look yellow. We picked one of them, and I said, well, this doesn't smell like the capsules that I've ever used, but we went ahead and put it in, mixed it all in the butter. And the more we mixed, the more we could smell it, and the more in doubt we were. And so I said, well, you just wait a minute. The men were out in the front there working on some machinery. I said, you just wait a minute, and I'm going to go out there and see if I can't find out what that is. So I went out there and talked a little while, and I finally asked them, well, what are those jelly-like capsules that you fellows have up there in the cabinet? My husband and several other men had been batching out there before we were married. They had some dogs that they thought had needed to be wormed, and the veterinary or the druggist or somebody had suggested these capsules. So they told me, well, that was the worm medicine for their dogs. So I never let on what we had done, but I just turned around, went back into the house, and told my sister. Well, we knew then that we couldn't use that butter, so I dumped it out then in the back. And, of course, the dogs had smelled it. They'd been taking that worm medicine. Of course, the dogs wouldn't even eat it because they knew what we were trying to do. Then there was another story that they tell on me that we raised up a few hogs in those days. My father was a traveling salesman, and one day as he was coming back to Alva, he stopped in, and the men were out there in a pen building something, working on something, pounding around, and he said, well, what are those men doing out there? And we had a sow that had these little pigs, and she was large, and of course when they lie down, they of course always lie on some of them and kill the little pigs. So what they were doing, of course, was building what they called a shell around the edge of the house so that when the old sow lay down, the little pigs would be under there and she wouldn't lie on them and kill them. Well, of course, I didn't know any better, and I said, well, they're doing the dumbest thing I ever heard of. I said, they're building a shelf around the edge of that hog house out there so that the old sow won't kill those little pigs. And I said, I would think that anybody with any sense would know that you couldn't keep those little pigs on that shelf.
Mrs. Wilcox, let's let you give us some history or something about your children and grandchildren and any other members of your family that you might want to bring us up to date on.
When both of our daughters were born after we moved to what's known as the Grimes Farm, and that was the only home that our daughters knew until they were married. Our older daughter, Catherine, was born in 1936. She is now married to Paul Fetke and lives in Dallas. They have 2 boys. Of course, they're just about as dumb about farm ways as I was when I first went on the farm, because boys raised in the city don't have much of a chance to learn about country ways. Our other daughter was born in 1939. Her name is Carolyn. She is now married to Mike McGinley. They are both in the school system up in Kiowa, Kansas. They have 2 children, a little boy, Kurt, and a little girl, Mary Ann, who come to visit us and left to come to the farm and play. Our 2 grandsons in Dallas, David and Doug Vatke, have the times of their lives when they all get together. The children build what they call forts and hideouts, and they bury treasure in various places on the farm. We had the homecoming parade the last time they were all together. Some candidate tossed out wooden nickels with his name on them. When they got back to the farm, they buried their wooden nickels as buried treasure. So sometime or other, if the termites or something doesn't eat the wooden nickels, somebody's going to dig up their buried treasure.
Ms. Wilcox, it looks like the Wilcox family is certainly going to have a pleasant holiday season when they come to visit your farm. We have just completed a most pleasant interview with Mr. and Mrs. Floyd Wilcox. The Wilcoxes lived on a farm north of Alva known as the Grimes Farm. Your interviewer today was James Cadigan on October 24th, 1972. The interview is for the Oklahoma Living Legends, part of the Oklahoma Christian College, and for the Oklahoma Historical Society. This interview is taken at Alva, Oklahoma.